about 25% discharge a day. So probably lasts more than like 2 days. 2 days. Yeah, probably. I don't think more than 2 days, but 2 days probably.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry for the delayed
I
start.
like to watch.
We're all ready?
I like the idea.
Parshas Truma. So, okay, this week we're going to learn about what may be considered the very first shul fundraising campaign. Right?
Okay.
Moshe is the first rabbi. So, like every good rabbi has to have a shul fundraising campaign. So, Moshe has, and to this week's Parsha, what looks like to be the very first shul fundraising campaign. Now,
First of several.
yeah, the first of maybe millions, you know. They're not done.
For him, it was at least 3.
So, all right, the first text is from this week's Parsha, in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verses 1 through 7. The very beginning of this week's Parsha, we see the word truma here a few times. It says, God spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and have them take for me an offering. So the Hebrew word for offering is truma. That's how we get the name of this week's Parsha. Have them take for me an offering. From every person whose heart inspires into generosity, you shall take my offering. And this is the offering that you shall take from them. And then it lists gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson wool, linen and goat hair, ram skins dyed red, tachash skins and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil and for the incense, shoham stones and filling stones for the ephod and for the choshen. This is the big campaign, right? This is the big ask. Have the Jewish people give offerings. Now, the interesting detail in God's appeal, essentially over here, is that he asks for the word truma. He asks for an offering 3 times. So if you look in the English, if every time that the word offering is a translation of the Hebrew truma, then there are 3 times that the word truma is offered at the beginning of this week's parsha. Sorry, the word truma is mentioned at the beginning of this week's parsha. Now, what Rashi is pointing out in the next text in your handout on this slide, in text 1b, is that each one of these 3 mentions has something special, something unique to teach us. So let's see, Rashi explains. Rashi, and you shall take my offering. The word is the tikuchu es trumati. Take my truma. So Rashi explains, what does those words mean? Our rabbi said 3 offerings are mentioned here. One is the offering of a beka, which is a half shekel per head, from which they made the sockets, which held up the tabernacle, as delineated and explained in Parshas Pekudei. Another is the offering of a beka per head for the community coffers, for the purchase of communal sacrifices. And another mention of truma is the offering for the Mishkan. Each individual's personal donation. The 13 materials mentioned in this section were all required for the work of the Mishkan or for the garments of the Kohanim, as you will find when you study them closely. So Rashi explains to us why we have the word truma 3 times. There's 3 different offerings, right? We have our little pushka here. We're putting in the coins. So the first mention of the word truma is for the sockets. And that is a half shekel. Everyone gives half a shekel. The next is mention of the word truma is for the communal sacrifices, the communal offerings. This is actually an annual tax, which we do, really at least symbolically until today. We offer it right before the fast after the fast, right? At the end of the fast before Purim, we do what's called machs l'shekel, and that's and then we have a one-time offering. The third time it's mentioned truma was a one-time offering for the building materials. So 3 different drives, let's say, 3 different appeals, all in one appeal. Now it's an interesting concept, like thinking about it financially. The first offering here mentions the sockets for the Mishkan. They formed a foundation holding the beams together, as it's explained, and there were 100 sockets all together in the Mishkan. Now, each socket held the beams together flush. So it was meaning there was space in the way that the silver was formed, so that the beams would go into the silver and be locked in, and they would be held together, flush together. Now, each one of these sockets was what's called a kikar of silver. Now, kikar of silver is roughly 125 pounds of silver per socket. So if you take 125 pounds of silver, you have 100 of these things all around the Mishkan. This was quite a capital campaign. Right now I think silver trades at about $15 to $18 an ounce. Yeah. So if you have 125 pounds in a kikar, and you have 100 of those, so you're talking about a multi-million-dollar campaign for capital to make the foundation thing. Now, the communal offerings, just to be clear, are you looking for the bathroom?
No, I'm looking for the
Oh. We're in the wrong building for that.
Yeah.
So, now, the communal offerings, we have the daily sacrifice. So the daily sacrifice was something which was given on behalf of all the Jewish people. That means you have 300 plus days a year, depending on what kind of year you have, lunar year, solar year, or mixed, whichever year it is. You have 350 plus, so no matter what year, times 2 a day, 700 animals offered without fail on behalf of the Jewish people. So these communal sacrifices is also a pretty significant expense for the temple. I don't know how much sheep go on the market. So, anybody have any insight on what it would cost to buy an unblemished sheep? A yearling. How many pounds is a sheep?
Yeah.
I have no idea. 50 pounds, maybe, I'm guessing? Yeah.
$10 per pound.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be. So that's a little Googling I should do next time, is to find out how much a sheep costs. Although that might get me flagged on some lists,
Yeah.
Now, then you have what's left, which is the building materials. So all the rest of the drapes, the wood, and everything else that you needed to make the tabernacle. Now, the next question over here, we see these sockets kind of holding the beams in place. We have a couple questions. First is that if we think about the way the 3 mentions of the word truma, as explained by Rashi, each represent a different campaign of fundraising, then why should there be 3 separate campaigns? If God's making this big appeal through Moshe to the Jewish people to collect from them in order to build the first, shul, the first Mishkan, why fundraise separately? Now, anybody here have any experience in fundraising or been involved, at least in giving or something? You know that there's maybe 2 different types of campaigns. One is what you call a capital campaign, and then you have your operational budget. So it would make sense. It would make sense that the things that are made for the Mishkan, which would be the first campaign with the sockets, and the last campaign, the building materials, would be into one campaign. And maybe the operational budget, which is an annual drive to apply the sacrifices, should be 2 separate campaigns. So we can fine-tune the question, which is, why should the sockets and all the rest of the materials be offered separately? And then that leads to a second question, which is, if we would think about it as one greater capital campaign, why do we limit the donations for the sockets to a half shekel per person? When it comes to all the rest of the materials, people can give an unlimited amount. So, it's like 2 sides of the same question. Well, why does it need to be a separate campaign? And if it's separate, why is the ask different? Why don't we ask for whatever anybody wants to give in order to build the foundation? So we have, these sockets. All right. So in order to understand that, we're going to tonight. This is a practical question on 3 times that the word truma is mentioned at the beginning of this week's Torah portion as a fundraising campaign. In order to answer it this week, we're going to take a spiritual detour, kind of going to say. In order, the assertion of tonight's class is that in order to understand the answer to why the sockets had their own special campaign, we'll need to understand it from a spiritual perspective. Because, as we'll soon see here in the next few verses, why we're going to take this detour. So, if text number 1 was this week's Torah portion at the beginning, the first 7 verses, so this goes right after, and is the 8th verse, where it says, it's famously, in at least a lot of Hasidic discourses, it's famous, V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'seicha. In the Hebrew, in text 2a, it reads, and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. Now, I see people who've been in my class for some years are nodding. I've heard this thing before. The Asuli Mikdash Vashkanti B'Seicham has some strange grammar. It says, Asuli Mikdash, they shall make me a sanctuary. Sanctuary, Mikdash, is singular. And then it says, and I will dwell in them. The Shachanti B'Seicham is in plural. So why it should say V'Seicho, I will dwell in it, not I will dwell in them. So text 2b, which is from the Rosh Chochmah, gives an explanation of what this means, is that really God's presence, as the English translation, God's presence resided primarily in a pure soul. Before I read any further, the concept of the Mishkan is to build a house for God, that their God should be revealed and reside, so to say, in the Mishkan. So where is the primary residence of God? So the Rosh Chochmah is explaining, even though there's a mitzvah to build a mikdash, Asuli Mikdash, when the second half of the verse says, V'shachanti v'seicham, I'll dwell in them, it means really the dwelling is in each soul. And this then is the meaning of, and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I'll dwell in them. It doesn't say I'll dwell in it, but it says in them, meaning inside of them, each and every one of the people involved. So that's what we're going to do in the following sections, sections 2 and 3 of tonight's class, is we're going to answer these first 2 questions, which is why do there need to be multiple campaigns, and of the multiple campaigns, why is one capital campaign unlimited? Everyone can give whatever they want. Whereas when it comes to the sockets, it was limited to a half shekel. So these 2 questions, we're going to answer the rest of it by understanding it from the perspective of our own Mishkan. This is a question which is relevant to each and every one of us and can be answered by providing insight to our own soul and to our own being, understanding our own mission here on earth. So as we say over here, our internal Mishkan, according to the Rosh Chochmah, it doesn't say I'll dwell in it, but rather I'll dwell in them. And that's how we'll understand it tonight, is that this Mishkan, this small little image you see over here, the Mishkan is really inside the hearts of each and every one of us. All right, any questions so far?
I just quickly about the animals.
Yeah.
What's that, Tachash?
Tachash.
Is that a beaver?
Rashi explains that this was a miraculous creature which only existed for the sake of building the Mishkan. So it was kind of like a unicorn. And actually, there are some ancient biblical artworks which depict it as the mythical unicorn, because it's an animal that never existed before and not after, like Rashi explained. It was just in order to take its skins for the Mishkan. Is that me?
No.
Oh.
It's turned up.
Okay, good.
There was some point in there where Moses had to tell everybody to stop bringing stuff. So I'm assuming you're going to head into that direction somewhere.
We're not going to touch on that, but it's a good point.
Because it seems like, well, okay, this is the amount, but if that was the amount, have we lent too much?
Right.
Tell them stop. Or was it to tell them stop because we needed that amount to get to that point?
The answer was they had too much. They had more than they could deal with.
Right. So
They had to tell them to stop.
Okay.
I think somebody's trying to reach you guys.
It might be Tim trying to reach the judge again by Veronicas.
Okay, so the next section we're going to talk about is the soul. We're going to give a kind of a brief description or brief discussion on the Jewish soul. And this it's ringing again?
Yeah.
Maybe he's trying to connect with you to tell you where he is.
Maybe he's passed out.
Check on
He wants to answer? In the car, he doesn't. But where would she get this soul?
There's more phones than people.
First world problem.
Yeah, all right. So I'll continue. So the next part is about the soul, the Jewish soul, and this complex composition of the soul. Okay. So now the soul can be expressed on many levels. So what we're going to start with is the core of the soul. Now, according to Tanya, which you see on the text here up on the board and in your handouts, in text 3 in your handouts, is the way the Alter Rebbe explains in the beginning of Tanya how the soul is not some type of spiritual creation, but rather the soul is an inseparable part of the Creator himself. And it's bound up with the Creator. So let's see the text number 3, the English translation of the second chapter of the book of Tanya. It says, the second soul of a Jew is truly a part of God above. As it is written, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The quote from the Genesis story, the beginning of the 5 books of Moses. And you breathed the soul into me.
There's somebody else, and they both were looked up.
Oh, wow! Hey, look who's here!
How you doing?
Welcome home.
Your smiling face.
Good to see you.
Oh, no, people.
Boy, now we're really going to be on a roll here with you here.
You know, if not him, I'll be frozen to death.
Oh, really? Yeah. Hasn't saved you, huh?
His telephones are here.
Yeah. Oh, so it was you calling?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was me.
And that's why I'm saying.
Right.
I don't know the stuff, but I'm just answering.
So keep calling. Don't worry, she's going to answer the phone. She's going to be like, who is this?
Door is locked.
Oh, the door stopped? Got moved out?
Somehow.
Oh, okay.
I'll put it back in.
Okay, thanks.
So if I don't go to work tomorrow, so you know why.
We're in trouble, huh? Okay. Don't lose my number. So, okay, so where we're at let's just do a quick review since we have an old face for joining us. So what we're talking about this week's Parshas Truma, is the first campaign for offerings to pay for the tabernacle. Now, at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Parshas Truma, it mentions the word Truma, which translates as offering, 3 times. So Rashi explains the 3 mentions of the word Truma to correspond to 3 different campaigns. One campaign is for the silver to make the sockets to hold the boards together, the foundation sockets. One campaign was to pay for the communal sacrifices, and one campaign was for donations for all the rest of the materials necessary to build the tabernacle. So our question from part number 1 is a 2-part question. Why do we need 3 different campaigns? If it's really just a let's build the Mishkan campaign, let it be one campaign altogether and many different details. Now, we parsed that question and said, okay, let's make a difference between a one-time capital campaign where they're going to build the Mishkan and an ongoing operational campaign of communal sacrifices. Because the sacrifices were going to be offered as long as there would be a temple, so we're talking thousands of years. This is an annual campaign which is going to go on for a long time. So let's split between the two, a one-time capital campaign and an operational budget. So if when it comes to the one-time capital campaign, we see an interesting distinction. When it comes to offerings for the foundation socket, that is a fixed amount. Each person has to offer half of a shekel of silver. But when it comes to the rest of the donations of materials, those are unlimited. In fact, as Bern pointed out, or we learned that this unlimited outpouring of generosity led to Moshe saying, stop, enough. We have more materials than we need for building the Mishkan, and he stopped the campaign. Now, so why multiple campaigns, and why the difference between unlimited donation, whatever your heart desires to give, you give, versus a fixed amount? Those are our questions. Now, we introduced an approach to how to answer this question. That based on verse 8, the beginning of this week's Torah portion, it says, "V'asali mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham," make for me a sanctuary in the singular, and I will dwell in them in the plural. So the question jumps off the page. The grammar is weird in this verse. What does it mean? So the Rishis Chachma we quoted from says that when it says b'seicham, it means in the soul of each and every person. That's the main dwelling, the main presence for God is in each and every one of our souls. So in order to understand the question, we're going to look at it from the perspective of our own soul. And we're going to answer our first two questions from the perspective of our own soul. That's what brings us to part number 2. We're going to start from the deepest part of the soul, the core of the soul. What is it? What is the soul? So that's text number 3, and we'll reread, and then we're all together. It says, chapter 2 of the Tanya, the second soul of a Jew is truly a part of God above. As it is written, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and you breathe it, the soul, into me. And it is written in the Zohar, he who exhales from within him. That is to say, from his inwardness and his innermost, for it is something of his internal and innermost vitality that the man emits through exhaling with force. Now, there's a lot here to unpack in text number 3. There's quite a bit here. The main idea I want you to take from it is that the Alter Rebbe is explaining how the soul is literally one with God. It's not a creation. It's not some separate spiritual entity. The soul is God himself. Now, a couple other things to unpack, which are just on the side, and we'll go forward after that, is how this bit where the soul is one with God is taken from the Genesis account. And in the Genesis account, it says that on all the creations, it says that God spoke and the thing came to be. Here, when it comes to the soul of man, is a different thing. Rather than speaking that there should be a soul and then there was a soul, it says that God blew the soul into his nostrils. So I think the expression, the term, that if you breathe heavy over and over again, right, you hyperventilate. So if you really breathe from your innermost, it's coming from inside of you, and it's a different thing than speaking. Proof, every Wednesday night I can go on for 90 minutes, no problem, right? But on and on and on and on. I can even go longer if you stay longer. But when it comes to deep breathing from deep within you, that you can't do very long at all. So the rabbis explain that this is the difference between all of the rest of creation, which is the product of God's speech, and the soul of man. The soul of man is blown into the nostrils. That's what the Zohar is being quoted from, is to explain is that speech is a more superficial part of expressing who we are. But breathing from deep within, that is a more inner expression. And that's where the soul comes from.
Why does it say the second soul?
The second soul? Because the first soul is what we call the vitalizing soul. So it's what makes us pretty much alive like any other creation. All right. Now, text number 4, as we continue this description of the soul and its nature. It says, souls, this is from Sefer HaMamarim, from the Hebrew year 5692. It's written by the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, and explains there that souls are rooted in the inner essence of God, blessed be He. As the verse states, you are sons to the Lord your God. Therefore, a Jew's soul is truly always connected to God. As the saying goes, embraced and cleaving to you. For the soul's essence is eternally wound up and attached to the essence of the light of God, blessed be He. Now, so this second teaching about the soul for tonight, we have Tanya saying it's one with God, and now we have this mimer of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe explaining its connection, it's bound up with God, it's cleaving to God. So this teaches us about the nature of the soul. Not just its quality, but what's natural to the soul. So this, that it's one with God and bound up with God, just like God is unlimited, so too the soul is unlimited. Just like God is eternal, so too the soul is eternal. Just like God is unchanged by creation, so too the soul is unchanged by creation. So this is giving us some insight, some background into a spiritual perspective on how to answer our questions. Now, the next text, 5a and 5b, are also from Maimarim of the various Rebbeim. So this is from the Hebrew year 5710, which is still the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he explains, nothing can conceal the essence of the soul. A Jewish person does not wish nor has the ability to detach, God forbid, from godliness. So here is what we mean by this unchanged nature. A soul and a body here on earth, we may, and we're going to talk about this in greater length tonight, but we have our moments, right? When it comes to being in touch with our soul, here on earth in our conscious state, we have our ups and our downs. But when we understand what the soul is in its nature, when we understand what the soul is in its essence, we realize that doesn't touch the true nature of the soul. The soul can never be apart from God. Even though we may feel like we're apart from God, we may think that we're apart from God, it may be our perception that that's the case, but in essence it's impossible for the soul to be separated from God. Now, and this bond is used to explain another phenomenon in this, which doesn't make sense, it doesn't go according to our feelings, which is what in Hebrew the expression is Mesirus Nefesh, self-sacrifice. See, there's nothing about self-sacrifice that feels right or makes sense. It is the deepest core of our first soul, the vivifying soul, to remain alive, right? And to perpetuate. We want to not just remain alive, but we want to have children and thrive and grow and all these type of things. This is what's natural to the state of being for a living creature. So we have this concept of self-sacrifice, the Mesirus Nefesh. Where does it come from? If it doesn't make sense, if we never feel like giving up our being, so where does it come from that we would be able to go on self-sacrifice, to give up our lives? So Chassidus explains that Mesirus Nefesh, self-sacrifice, is the product of the essence of the soul. So if you had like this terrible option of either give up your life or give up God. So the soul, according to text 5a, can't be separated from God. So it would rather give up its life than give up its connection. And that's what text 5b is explaining. The ability every Jew has to sacrifice his life in order not to be disconnected, God forbid, from God's oneness is not rooted in one's desire. Which means he has the option to not sacrifice his life, but he chooses to sacrifice instead. Right? Feels right. That's not where it comes from. Rather, because a Jew cannot separate, God forbid, from God's oneness by virtue of this godly soul. So, we take this core perspective first, of what the soul is. It's a part of God. It's one with God. It's an actual part of God himself. No matter how far down here on earth we feel or think, the soul is always bound to God. And this idea that we can't separate from God's oneness is what is the reason, so to say, it's beyond reason, but it's the cause, let's say, for self-sacrifice. Now, moving on to the soul from its essence, now we have the expression of the soul. Now, once we start from the core and understanding what the soul is in its essence according to this, then we have to kind of work and try to align our feelings, our thoughts, our actions in accordance with who we are in our essence. Now, in order for the soul to do that, in order for the soul to live out its purpose, in harmony with its essence, it's been given certain tools. Now, in the Hasidic terminology, the tools of the soul are called garments, or in Hebrew, levushim, garments of the soul. Now, the Alter Rebbe, again, will quote from Tanya, in chapter 3, the following chapter after we quoted before, says the soul comprises of 10 faculties. Now, these 10 faculties are corresponding to the 10 supernal spherot, which is another big concept, is that the spiritual makeup of the soul is a reflection of the divine makeup found in creation. The way Chassidus and Kabbalah explains, that God limited his infinite light in order to create. And that limitation took the form of 10 divine attributes. So the 10 divine attributes, which are the force of creation, the way Kabbalah explains, are reflected in the 10 soul attributes, the 10 spherot. So we have Chokhmah, which is wisdom, Bina, understanding, Das, which is knowledge, and the 7 days of creation, which correspond to the emotions. Chesed, kindness, Gevura, which is power, Tseres, beauty, and so on. And the soul as well is divided into two. It's divided into intellect and emotion. The intellect includes Chokhmah, Bina, and Das, while the midot, the emotions, are measures, are love of God. Dread and awe of him, glorification of him, and so on. So when we talk about the soul and its essence, its nature, now we have these garments, these faculties for it to express the soul. So you think about that, the intellect, the way it's listed here in chapter 6. So the intellect is how the soul acts on earth in harmony with its essence. As we learned in the first text in Tanya, the soul is godliness. It is God. So how does the soul express that? By intellect learning Torah. So it has the three faculties of the intellect, by learning Torah, by understanding Torah, by having knowledge of Torah. This is the way the soul expresses itself in harmony with its essence, intellectually. So too with emotions. Here, as text 6 is explaining, we have all this emotional range. So one way for the soul to express itself in our life is through prayer. Right? When you have an emotional experience in prayer, that's the way that the soul is expressing itself emotionally. There we go. So too, when it comes to the love we have for one another, right? The great mitzvah of Avas Yisrael, to love one another. So that's the way that the soul is able to express itself here on earth through positive emotions of love for one another. Now, we've presented this kind of like as a linear thing, right? We have the essence of the soul, and the essence of the soul expresses itself through its faculties and within the body, emotions, intellect, this kind of thing. Now, it's important to point out that it is not a two-way street. I'm presenting it as a linear thing, but it doesn't go both directions, meaning essence can and should be expressed through the faculties of the soul, the garments. But it doesn't go the other way. meaning the expressions of the soul, intellect, and emotions don't change the essence. So that's takes us to the next text, which is a bit of a longer text. But this is from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He wrote a weekly Torah portion class according to Chassidus. So this is from that book, Torah Or. And it says, the soul itself is a pure light that cannot be divided into intellect and emotion. The soul's intellect and emotion are as garments for the soul, meaning that the soul possesses them, but they do not define the soul. Rather, they are called enhancements, for the soul is clothed and adorned by them. This enhancement is a decoration that adorns and impacts the soul to the extent that they even unite as one. Now, this can be likened to the relationship between body and soul. Though the body is a garment to the soul, nevertheless, the soul is affected by the happenings of the body. When the body's finger is bruised, the soul feels it. Similarly, when the soul desires to move the body in a certain way, the limb obeys that desire immediately as soon as the will arises. The foot walks, etc. It's not necessary for the thought to progress from the brain to the foot, for if so, there would be a delay. The reality is that the body doesn't wait even a moment. As soon as the soul decides, the body obeys. But this is only because the body and the soul have bonded to the point that the soul drives the body as though it was part of itself. Though the body is a garment to the soul, it becomes one with the soul. Now, the same is in the next slide. The same can be said of the intellect and emotions of the soul. They are merely enhancements and garments for the soul, and the tools by which the soul operates, like an axe in the hand of a woodchopper, to love with its ability to love and to understand with its wisdom, etc. All this and the like is just the soul's actions and interactions with those around it. But the soul itself is higher than all these attributes, where the intellect and emotion are interchangeable. A small child likes small things, etc. And the intellect progresses as we age. But all this does not apply to the soul's essence, which does not change at all. This is the elaboration the Alter Rebbe provides of understanding it's not a two-way street. So we have the essence that is expressed through the garments. It is even like one with the garments, but it doesn't work the other way. The garments don't impact the essence. Now, he uses the example of the axe in the hands of the woodchopper, but we could really think of this as the tools in the hands of any craftsman. We think of actually, one thing I had this week, I was working on a Purim party and getting people to come. So part of modern getting people to come to things is through Facebook, right? Facebook invites and reaching your friends through Facebook. So we're working with graphic design in order to make an ad, and then we were working on Shalach and the gift. And the gift should work together with the theme of the party, graphic, all these different things. It was able to express our creativity and our thoughts through these tools, right? This software. But so our expression of creativity came out through the tools of the craft, but it didn't go the other way. The fact that we had these tools didn't in any way limit or impact the source of the creativity. So we can understand this, in lots of different applications, lots of different examples. But the idea being is that it's not a two-way street. Now, here's not graphic design tools, but the other ones I see people using sometimes. So, as lofty as the soul's properties are, they are not the soul's identity. So intellect, emotions, they're high powers of the soul, but they're not the soul itself. Now, why do we need to know this? What's important about all this abstractions of the soul and its garments, these different types of things? So the one key idea that Chassidus explains why it's so important for us to understand the soul and the way it's manifest and how it's not a two-way street is first and foremost is because it impacts how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others. Now, what does this mean is that when we think about it as not a two-way street, loving someone for who they are in their essence means seeing beyond the garments of their soul. The person is not limited by what they do. They're not defined in their essence by what they say or think or do. Now, it does go one direction. Their soul does express itself by these things, what they say, think, and do, but it doesn't go the other way. And it's also an important thing, not just for loving others, but for loving yourself as well. And having a positive, self-image. We may have regrets for some of the things that we've done. Or we may have been born with certain challenges where we're not blessed with all the talents, right? We don't have the full toolkit necessarily, whether it's our intellect, our emotions, whatever it may be. But this in no way diminishes our inherent value. Just like it doesn't diminish the value of others. And that's how we can truly love one another, is by seeing past the garments. So too, it's for ourselves. It's important to realize that while we may be lacking things or regret certain things, it doesn't change who we are in essence. All right, this is the brief background about the soul. Any questions so far about what we said about the soul? No? You're not sure if you should ask?
Yeah, I was trying to maybe wait till we got to the end, but since you brought it up. So, in Scripture itself, because we were talking about the soul, but, when you're reading, especially when you look at the Hebrew, obviously there's different terms used, JLI, Nefesh, and they all seem to have distinctive meaning.
Yeah.
But as you talk about it, you seem to be saying soul as though the terms are interchangeable.
Right.
So how do you kind of reconcile the differences between those terms, and then, what do they mean in correspondence?
Good question. Yeah, there's, I think, like a poverty of language when it comes to English. Because when we use the word soul, we use it in lots of different, in Jewish language teachings, we use it in a lot of different contexts, and they don't mean all the same thing. You're right. They have nefesh, ruach, neshama, different, Hebrew words, which all are translated the same way as soul. So I'll just do a quick answer on some of these ideas. So, and we talked about multiple souls, right? So how can it be the soul if there's one, two, first one, second one? What does that mean?
Right.
Okay, so the nefesh, the way it's explained in Chassidus, is the first level of the soul, let's call it. Now, what the nefesh does is it enlivens the body. The vitality. It's also let's call it the utility or the functionality of the body. So the example I give is right now, I'm teaching an expression of my soul, and I'm imparting, knowledge, these type of things. So the nefesh and gives me the power to speak. You asked the question, and I had the power to hear it. And if I want to illustrate that my hands can work, I can pick stuff up and change the slides with my hand. All of this vitality of the body is the level of the soul, which we call nefesh.
So that what makes you human.
I don't want to go that far.
Okay.
It's what makes my human parts work. Okay, so ruach. So ruach, the way Chassidus explains, is that spiritual power which enlivens the emotional experience. So very brief. Again, there's lots more written on this. We can learn on it for years. But very brief. Chassidus explains the idea of emotion is directional. That things that while we have this great spectrum of emotions, they're primarily love and fear. And love and fear can be understood as emotions directionally. The things that you love, you want to be close to. It's drawing you close. The arrow is pointing towards the object that you love. Fear, you want to be far away from. So you draw the arrow away from objects that you fear. So that emotional experience, that emotional range, what are we drawn towards? What are we repulsed by? These type of things, that soul capacity is enlivened by ruach. Then we have neshama. So neshama is, according to Chassidus, this idea where we have the ability to think. With the ability, so, I'm tell stories, symbolic meaning, language, associative meaning, all kinds of, all this toolkit we have that I use more than my hammers and screwdrivers and stuff. That is what we call neshama. That is enlivened by the level of the soul, neshama.
So the second soul related to the nefesh, and is the neshama related to the godly aspect.
So the nefesh, ruach, and neshama really, as we're saying, is that it's like you have lots of different things that make you human. That's why I was hesitant to say one is what makes me human. Is all of those things make me human, right? The fact that I can talk puts me together in a small set of creatures in the world. But that's not the only thing that makes me human, because if I were to be mute, I would still be human. The fact that I'm a biped, and I have opposable thumbs, those make me human also. But if I didn't have those things, it wouldn't make me less human. Same thing with, we have the friendship circle. They deal with people with emotional and intellectual challenges. For instance, like autism. One of the challenges of autism is not being able to recognize and understand the emotional underpinnings of a human interaction. So they are lacking that. It doesn't mean they're less human. So the totality of these capabilities are part of what makes us human, makes us alive. So that's what we mean. So as far as that, your question?
Yeah, it is. I'm just trying to figure out how do you divide the second soul from the godly soul? Right. So the second soul that we're quoting in Tanya, for the beginning of the text, was, here we're talking about it more like enlivening, meaning an animal soul, versus a second soul, which is a godly soul. Now that's a whole separate thing. Besides the specific meaning of nefesh, ruach, and neshama, we also have, the way Chassidus explains, a duality. You have a duality which is like all of those things, your body, your emotion, and your intellect are, there's a duality of like that which is animal or alive and that which is godly. So let's put it one way, let's put it like this. You have the physical things you do. So there's one of the great examples brought in Chassidus that's very physical about what we do is eating. So the animal way to eat is for sustenance, right? To be alive. A godly way to eat is for the sake of a mitzvah. Whether the eating itself is a mitzvah, like matzah on Pesach, or that I'm eating not just to be alive, but that I'm eating for a higher purpose. My life should be in order to do mitzvahs. My life should be in order to learn Torah. Okay. So it's a whole different motivation for why we eat. So that's the two souls there. That's in context in the Tanya. So those are more like terms. Just the scripture. You're kind of breaking the book beyond the terms.
Right.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. Just a problem with getting, what is the essence? It's the word, the breath of God, but it's too literal. Right? It's not.
Right.
There is no breath of God.
Right.
So what is the essence?
Good question. So I'm going to duck your question like this. It says anything that you can point to and say it's the essence isn't it.
You got me thinking.
Like the question.
That's my safety, valve.
I know it's still any glyphs. I mean.
Yeah. So I guess a lot of when we say these things about essence, the best we can do to describe it is by what it isn't. So we have like a certain knowledge by elimination.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say it's a part of God, and it is godliness, so we don't really know what God is, but we know what it isn't. So as a creator, which is the English word we've used a lot over here, it has to be limitless, because creation implies a beginning. So we know that it doesn't have a beginning because it's the creator. Creation has a beginning, so therefore it doesn't have limit. We talked about it's unchanged. That was one of our texts here tonight. So we know what it means for things to change. They have a beginning and they have an end. They're impacted by their circumstances. So essence is something which is unchanged. So we don't know what that is because everything that we see gets changed. Everything that we encounter has a beginning and end. So this essence we can only really define by what it isn't. Does that help? No, but does it make sense a little?
Yeah.
At least posters off the question. Okay. So back to our original questions for tonight. Now we added some information because we're going to approach this from a spiritual perspective. So the original question is, how or why did the sockets have their own campaign? Their own word truma. Why did they have their own campaign, according to Rashi? And our other question is on this campaign, why is one campaign fixed at a half a shekel and the other capital campaign is unlimited?
Has to do with the significance of the gift or the size of the gift.
No, the first to do with the soul, because we talked about.
Right.
The first is the amount that anybody could afford, and so they have something of their own, so they all build it.
Right.
Where the other part is, you can, you do it, and that's good.
Right.
The first gives you part of the ownership in some sense.
Okay, good. And in equal stake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the amount affordable to any.
Beautiful. That's perfectly said. It's an equal stake. Now, if we take the running start of thinking about our soul, and we talked about the soul as on the one first, we talked about it as essence, and then we talked about it as faculties, qualities of the soul, tools of the soul. We think about those two ways, then that goes perfectly, and that's how we'll be able to answer our questions. When it comes to that which is equal for everybody, that's essence. And when it comes to that which is depending on your circumstances, now the way I heard your suggestion is like some people are wealthy enough to give more, and some people aren't. So that's one way of differentiating between people, is how blessed they are materially. So that's just one way, and you can take all the different ways that people are different, and all the many ways rather that people are different, and that's perfectly said. Now, let's see how the next text over here, because you're right on point, works. The Rebbe explains over here, what are the tapestries, the beams, the sockets, what are all these things we're talking about as the capital campaign? What do they represent in our soul? Again, the verse, V'asuli mikdash v'shchanti v'seicham, make for me a mikdash, and I will dwell in them, gives us the license to learn this as a spiritual lesson, right? Because God's dwelling in each and every one of us, according to Rishis Chochmah. So what is our beam? What is our socket? How does that apply to us? The Rebbe here in L'Kutei Sichos explains, in godly service, donation of the sockets refers to self-nullification and acceptance of God's will, which comes from the essence of the soul. So what is the sockets? How does that mean for us today? Like, I'm going to go home and build the Mishkan, how am I going to do that? So I'm going to offer half a shekel, whatever that means exactly, for the making socket. What is socket? The Rebbe explains it is self-nullification, accepting God's will. Now in Hebrew, in the Hasidic term, is something, again, lots of ink has been used to explain Chassidus, the expression Kabbalah's O, accepting the yoke, accepting God's kingship.
So is that like the basic foundation?
That is the foundation. It is the paramount value, Jewish value, promoted in Chassidus. It's the foundation of everything else. Now,
It's an interesting analogy, too, because the socket is normally something that's not there. It's
right.
an opening that something else goes in.
Right, to accept something else.
Accept something else.
Right.
So it's sort of a vacuum. It's sort of like it's a null value. There's nothing there, and that's what makes it there.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to do this fast. You just reminded me of a beautiful story. It's my own story, so I think it's beautiful. So, besides Hasidic teachings, we're quoting here from Maimarim, Sichos, with their Rebbeim, teachings of Chassidus. So, and this is an important thing, teachings of Chassidus, especially the way they're written, and then we capture them in the text, and we discuss them here in our classes. But an important way of conveying the teachings of Chassidus is in the context of what's called a Fabrengen. Now, when these Maimarim and Sichos were said, it was in a Fabrengen. Now, but that's a special kind of Fabrengen where the leader of the Fabrengen is the Rebbe. But there's a less formal level of a Fabrengen, which is a Fabrengen amongst the Chassidim. Not with the Rebbe at the front, leading from the table, but the Chassidim together Fabrengen and working on service of God. So, I was, a few years in yeshiva as an unmarried man, and would go to the Fabrengens. It was an important part of learning. So now comes the time in my life where I got engaged, and I was soon to be married. And the head of the yeshiva, who I'd spent many hours together learning, and both inside the book as well as learning in Fabrengens together, he says to me, "Well, now that you're getting married, something's going to change. You're not going to be able to stay to the end of every Fabrengen." So Fabrengens, like for instance Thursday nights, they might end like 5 or 6 in the morning. They might start at 10 o'clock at night and go for 8 or 9 hours at a Fabrengen. And he's like, now that you're going to be a married man, you have a life and a wife, you have to go home. So he tells me, he says, don't think of it though that you are missing anything of the Fabrengen. That's not the right way to think about it. Since your life is changing, whatever you can stay for, that's the whole Fabrengen. That's how you have to think. So, I heard that. And when my wife and I were first married, we lived together in Israel. We lived for the first 4 months of our married life together in an apartment in Israel. And a nice thing about where we lived in Israel is we were walking distance to the Western Wall, which is a nice place to go Friday night. There's thousands of Jews all praying together. It's a very beautiful scene, everything. And I have close friends that live in the Old City from my time when I lived in the Old City. And I wanted to take my new bride to my friends, for our Shabbos when we first moved to Israel. So we're going to a friend's house for a Friday night meal. And I stopped because I wanted to make sure that I had the siddur that I use at where I was going. So I stopped in a Chabad shul in the Old City. I went and grabbed a siddur, take with me to the meal, thinking I'll bring it back before we go home. I go, we have a nice meal, it's lovely, everything's really great. We're walking home, and it's time to return the siddur. As I walk into this Chabad shul in the Old City of Jerusalem, there's a Fabrengen going on. Now, I've left my newly married bride out in the street, in front of the shul, and I've wandered my way in, and there's a Fabrengen going on. Now, I'm still maybe more used to being not married than married, so I'm drawn like a moth to the flame to the Fabrengen, and I'm like, I stick my head in, and they're talking. At the Fabrengen, they're talking, and they say, what is a hug? We're talking about a hug. And he goes on for a minute or so about how a hug is a profound expression of emotional connection, right? It's a beautiful physical expression of how much you love someone. So after he goes into like this expression of love, he says, but think about like the mechanics of a hug. He says, in order to give someone a hug, you have to make a space where you aren't. If you push yourself into the hug, it doesn't work. You can only embrace and give over this emotion by making a space where you aren't. And once I heard that, I was like, that's a hole for Brangen. Now I can go back out to the street and rejoin my bride. You know, because it would be the socket. What is a socket in Avodas Hashem? What is a socket in serving God? You have to make a space where you are not. Now, that making a space where you are not is self-nullification. That's what we call bittul. That's what we call Kabbalah soul. Now, Kabbalah soul literally translates as accepting the yoke, accepting the burden of God's kingship. Now, this term, ol, a yoke, is an important term because going back to our animal drives, there's the yoke you put on an ox, right? We have to believe this is true, right? Now we use basic machines. We don't use oxes anymore. It's like the old days. But, you know, the ox is pulling the plow. And the ox doesn't want to do that. The ox would rather roam free in the field and, you know, eat grass, whatever ox are into. But in order to make the ox do the will of the master, you put this big heavy burden on its shoulders and a bit in its mouth, and then you can harness the power of the animal to do the will of the master. So that's the image of Kabbalah soul. Kabbalah soul means accepting God's kingship in a way that you nullify your own desires and do what it is that God wants you to do. It means you're accepting the things that you don't understand. You're accepting the things you don't feel like doing. That is what he's talking about over here. That is acceptance of God's will. That's what the sockets represent. Now, what do the beams represent? So the beams, text number 9, the Zohar explains, the length of each beam was 10 cubits. Its width, a cubit and a half. These 10 cubits, this is Gufa Dvar Nash. I translated over here as the 10 cubits of the size of man's body. But it doesn't really mean that we're as tall as a cubit, as a beam. What he means is that the height of the beam is 10 because the number 10 is specific to the composition of the person, which we quoted earlier in tonight's class, the 10 faculties, emotions, intellect, 7, 3. Those 10 altogether represent emotions and intellect. That's the 10 of the beams. So the sockets are Kabbalah's ol, sacrifice, acceptance, whereas the beams are like who we are in our intellect, who we are in our emotions, our identity, what does make sense to us, what feels right to us. That is what the beams represent. So the question over here is, like, if the sockets represent our inner unchanging core and our acceptance of God's kingship because of our oneness with God, and the beams represent our emotions and our intellect, the parts that make us who we are, when it comes to serving God, which is primary?
Can we answer the question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'm thinking that beams, because beams hold up and they give support.
Right.
But the socket, even though it's smaller, seems to, it's a connection. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the socket.
So the beams are what makes the building impressive, right?
Right.
It gives its height, it gives its beauty, it gives, especially when you start talking about tachash skins, I thought you asked before, what are the tachash? There's like this rainbow skins of this miracle creature. You know, that's spectacular. So when it comes to building the tabernacle, it's impressive because of the beams and the coverings. But it doesn't stand without the foundation.
I'm thinking of the socket. I'm sorry. I'm thinking when you were talking about the socket, Vern was talking about, you know, like a vacuum that you put in and screw something in.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about, the tabernacle or the socket?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's clear to see over here what's going on.
Oh,
but you have the beams, and then you have a silver socket holding it in place.
Oh, I'm thinking of a jewel.
And then the curtains are what make the structure based off of the space between each of the beams.
I was thinking like a whole screw of jewel in there.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's why I'm thinking. So yeah, socket would.
So we have an answer, at least the Rebbe gives an answer over here. It says the sockets were the lowest part of the tabernacle, the lowest part of the Mishkan. Nevertheless, they were the foundation of the entire tabernacle, including the beams and the tapestries, though they were higher than the sockets. So a lesson is clear, you know, when we think about what's primary, a lesson is clear is that we can't build something sturdy. When it comes to our own personal Mishkan, when it comes to making a dwelling place for God in our own life, then we have to have first a proper foundation.
I'm thinking, are the sockets hidden away?
They're like on the ground.
But you don't see.
I guess, you know, where does your eye go first? You know,
Right.
it's visible, like, but your eye would go first to the structure.
Right. So it's almost like what's inside is what's wrong.
Right.
Right.
Like when you drove up to here.
Right.
You know, what did you see first?
The building.
The building.
Not the foundation.
Right. You know, in the building, in the foundation, you don't see, there is part that's submerged under the ground here because it's not a portable structure. But there is part of the foundation that you can see, and it's not what draws your eye to the building. Now, so this idea that everybody's explaining over here is that you have to have the foundation. Now, applying that practically, you know, at least conceptually, is that first you have to accept, you have to nullify any separate will you may have and accept God's will. And then from there, you can build up emotional expression, intellectual understanding, you know, actions, these type of things. And this goes to the answer you gave to our original questions. The sockets, which we've now explained represent the essence of the soul, they were equal, everybody. The boards, the curtains, the materials, those were our intellect, our emotions, the way we're different from one another. The reason they were a separate donation, the sockets, from the rest of the materials, even though it's all one great big capital campaign, the reason it was separate was in order to highlight the difference between the two. The difference between essence and faculties. What makes this all the same and how we're different. And the reason we separate the two is because they are, in fact, two different dimensions of divine service. And therefore, they all deserve their own separate foundation, their own fundraising campaign. Now, the next text, text 11, is another teaching from Okutei Sichos, and it's another kind of longish one. So here, let's read it. The donations that were set to be equal for every Jew, the half shekel, was specifically for the sockets, while the tapestries and the vessels of the tabernacle were covered by donations in any amount chosen by the Jewish people. The explanation is, though the sockets were the lowest part of the tabernacle, at the same time they were the foundation of the entire tabernacle. Indeed, upon them the beams rested. Therefore, every Jew had an equal share in the donation for the sockets, which means in the foundational and general principles and acceptance of God's will and self-nullification, rooted in the essence of the soul. Because by the essence of their souls, all Jews are connected and share one Father. next slide, by contrast, all other parts and details in the tabernacle, the beams, the tapestries, etc., as they exist in the soul, are divine services with specific abilities. The beams, which are 10 cubits high, allude to the 10 inner faculties of the person, while the more general faculties are represented by the tapestries, which hung over the tabernacle from above. Because no two people's intellect and emotion are alike, it follows that there are differences between one person's level and type of service and another's, in accordance with their abilities. So these different types of people, these different types of seeing the world and feeling the world and interacting with the world, they're represented in this story by the different materials. But when it comes to the expression of the soul in its essence, we all do things the same. I mean, there's an element which is all the same. So, for instance, take an example like Shabbos candles, right? Why and when and how and the details and the understanding and all, there could be different levels, right? Also, I see it, the emotional experience. And my family, when my daughters, which thank God are blessed, 7 daughters, so I've seen this now 6 times already, is when they become 3 years old, our custom is they start lighting their own Shabbos candle separately. And the first time they light the Shabbos candle, after waiting their turn, for 2 almost 3 years, they like their first time. It's so precious and special, right? And then it happens after you've done it every week, every Yom Tif, every 60 times a year. You get to be not only 7 years old, and it's not new anymore, right? So there's differences in your life cycle of how you do things. There's differences in our natural talents, intellectually and emotionally. There's difference in our knowledge base. So when it comes to like our own approach to how we're experiencing the mitzvah, that's separate. But when it comes to the essential impact of the mitzvah itself, it's all the same. The same flame on a wick and a candle. It's all the same. No matter who you are, no matter what stage you're at, no matter how well you understand, no matter how you feel about it, that mitzvah, once it's done, we're all bound together in the same way. So this is the 2 dimensions and why we needed 2 separate campaigns. All right, now once we understand this like essential core to our own personal tabernacle, and we realize that's what's perhaps primary, and we have the 2 separate accounts, we have over here an interesting thing. Text number 12 is from the Medrash, and it pulls out a rule for learning Torah. And it says, whenever it says li, like for instance, Ba'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham, right? Quoted that Hebrew line a few times. So you have then the word Ba'asu li, which means to me. Whenever you have a word like li, there's a rule of what that means. Now, here, let's look inside. What's the rule? Text 12 from that Medrash Vayikra Rabbah. It says, anywhere the word li is mentioned, which can be translated as to or for me, the subject at hand is eternal. So, when we see that, it talks about the different shrumas, the different offerings. The offering to me, the truma that has the word li, is referring to the sockets. So the word li is associated with the word, so the truma, which has to do with the sockets. Now, why we take this rule from the Medrash in text number 12, why should it be that the eternal element over here has to do with the sockets? Meaning, if we had the choice, the one that was going to be annual for as long as the temple would be built, that one seems like maybe would be a better option for li. Why should it be the sockets specifically that are the ones that are everlasting? Now, again, the only way we can understand this question is if we take the same spiritual approach. When it comes to the essence of the soul, when it comes to how we're all even, then that's eternal. When it comes to that level of acceptance of God, we're doing it beyond our reasoning. We're doing it beyond what makes sense to us. We're doing it beyond our feeling, what we feel like doing. We're doing it because of the essence of who we are. That approach to godly service is infinite. But when we serve God according to our intellect and our emotions, not that they're bad, they're also part of the Mishkan. But that's not unchanging. It's like by definition, the way we feel and think about things is changing. It's evolving. So that's the changing nature of thoughts and emotions. This one-time donation of a half a shekel for the socket, the word li teaches us this same element when it comes to our divine service. That if we do, and we realize that the doing, the accepting of the burden, and taking it on, if we have that as our foundation, that will be eternal. And now the next text, text 13, this tells the story, and it goes a step further. If emotions and intellect are changing, acceptance is eternal, based on this insight. One way to have our intellect and our emotions more in line with our essence, when we talked about before about this linear approach, how do we get our intellect and emotions to be manifestations of the essence of our soul? By having the sockets first. By having a do mentality, I will do, and then that will lead to that the emotions and intellect are more in line with your essence. And I believe this is the last text of the night, text 13. Text 13 tells a fascinating story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe had the challenge of being the head of the Lubavitch Hasidic movement in Russia at the time of after the Communist Revolution. After they overthrew the Tsar and they had the revolution and a whole new approach to things in Russia, he was the one who was leading the Hasidic movement at that time. And without being there, just from what I've read in books, and not even being alive, to have been there, but long ago. I think it's 100 years this year, right?
Yes.
So 100 years this year. So one of the ways that this was a pressure on a leader of a Hasidic Jewish movement is that part of the Communist Revolution was to stamp out religion. An atheist approach to understanding things. So there was a few times that as an active leader of a Jewish movement, that was in conflict with the new leadership, the new government in Russia, and the Rebbe was arrested as a result of his activities. So this text 13, is taken from the diaries or the writings, at that time of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, describing one of the times that he was arrested. When I say one, it's because he was arrested more than once. And in particular, the people who liked to make his life particularly difficult during his arrest were Jewish communists who embraced the atheist belief. And now they felt they had the power over the Rebbe after having arrested him, and they wanted to give him an extra hard time. So this text describes a fascinating conversation which took place as his Jewish communist capture, were trying to test his faith. Text 13. In this conversation, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, their first question was, do you observe all the details of your religion, cover your head, wear tzitzis, all the other details you keep exactly out of rational conviction or out of faith and habit? You know, that's a question. Well, what's the basis of this? He explains, out of absolute rational conviction. So it's going to go back and forth, me, them, me, them. This is written in first person by the Rebbe, so the me here is the Rebbe, and the them is the Jewish communists interrogating him. To them, if you are indeed so convinced of such matters of faith, then convince us as well. Bring us to your place of religious discipline. Me. I'm ready to fulfill your request, and you certainly will enable me to do so. You know as well as I do that if one will ask a student of astronomy in passing to explain the orbit and paths of the stars, he will certainly reply that it is impossible to explain all this quickly while standing in the middle of the street. If you want to understand, he will say, come up with me to the observatory, and there I will show you the stars and their paths. The next slide, the story continues. So too, if you want absolute conviction of God and His Torah, come with me to a house of God. Put on tefillin. Eat kosher food. Keep Shabbos. And your minds and hearts will be purified so that you can understand ethical concepts. And slowly, slowly, you will ascend the steps of understanding until I can bring you to a logical recognition. Then you will have absolute rational conviction of the godly religion and His Torah. Now, stop here. This is the flow we've been talking about. First the socket, so you need the foundation. Then you can build on the foundation, and you can have the 10 cubits. You can have your emotion, you can have your intellect. It can make logical sense to you. But you have to start with the sockets. So they didn't like this. They continue. First explain it to us rationally. And then we can accept to observe the Jewish faith. Until you bring us rational conviction, we cannot accept it. Next slide. He says, surely you well know that the food a person eats doesn't only satiate him and give him strength, but also builds up his body. For the food becomes his blood and flesh. Medical science explains well how this transformation of the bread and meat and all other food into flesh takes place. And doctors with years of experience understand the process. But what would you say of a person who refuses to eat and drink until he understands exactly how the food and drink become his flesh and blood? This is how it works. First, you must believe in the process and eat and drink. And while you do that, you can go and learn the medical science behind the process. Only then can you reach an understanding of how the food and drink become flesh and blood. And he concludes, the words had an effect on him, on them. So, this story is a powerful story, and it's telling us that for our life, when we're trying to build a mishkan of our soul, we're trying to build a dwelling place for God in our own lives, which is what the verse is telling us we all have to do. I'll build each and every one of you. So as we set out that challenge of building a mishkan, building a place for God in our own lives, the real conviction of intellect, the real emotional connection to service of God can only come built on top of our inner core, of our inner essence. Once we have the inner core, the inner essence, this foundation of the essence of the soul, the socket of the tabernacle, then from there, the story tells us, that's where we can build up conviction. That's where we can build up our logical understanding. That's where we can build up our emotional connection, the proper thoughts and actions in service of God. So that's the lesson of the 3 campaigns. Moshe's first capital campaign to build the very first shul. The lesson is that we should have this in mind with everything that we do. That if we first establish a strong foundation, we can build a strong and beautiful mishkan on top. And also a very beautiful lesson is the opposite way. If we see in others that's not so beautiful, if we feel about ourselves that it's not so beautiful, and we have like I said before, we have our regrets, we have our shortcomings, we can go back to the first step. We can go back to that self-nullification, that simple, pure acceptance. And from there, we can start again. From there, we can recognize how each and every one of us is a beautiful and perfect soul bound to God. All right. Any questions?
Good.
Yes, you have a question.
So the half shekel was not to get a census of the draft age men. I thought it was
Not in this time. There were other times when, in order to get a census, they would collect shekels. But this was a divinely ordained capital campaign to build the Mishkan. But you're right. There are other times when that was used for a head count. All right. So go out there, collect some silver. Seems like it's a multi-million. Hold up something beautiful.
Okay.
All right. Any questions from home?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nope. No questions from home. Stop the recording then.